In this video, we're going to solve some more absolute value inequalities, so just building on the kind of basics. All right, so similar to solving absolute value equalities, our very first step is to isolate the absolute value. We have to get that absolute value by itself. We can't touch inside an absolute value, so the only way we can get rid of it is get it by itself and then apply the property of absolute values. We can't like add and subtract things. All right, and remember, absolute values are not like parentheses. I can't add something outside of a absolute value. I can't distribute something into it. Absolute values are kind of strange, so you just want to kind of ignore them almost until they're by themselves and then do something after that. So again, with this absolute value, I can't add 3 to both sides or something like that to get rid of the 3. So I can't touch this. So I want to get rid of this 2 and this -4 first. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides and divide by 2. I divide it by +2, so the inequality goes the same way. All right, so now we have the absolute value by itself. That's our very first big step, isolate the absolute value. And now I think about if I have an absolute value being bigger than a number, that means I want the kind of outsides of the number line because I want my distance to be bigger than this number. So I separate into 2 separate inequalities. All right, so you can see in my test example here, whatever's inside the absolute value has to be to the left of -2 and to the right of +2. So it doesn't matter if there's a bunch of stuff inside this absolute value. Whatever is in here needs to share the same properties as this. So it needs to be less than -2 or it needs to be bigger than +2. So it's the exact same thing if it's just an x, but since this is not just an x, it's all of this, I just replace those with that as well. So if you know the basics of absolute value, it's the same thing. You're just copying down whatever's on the inside. And now I add 3, divide by 5, add 3, divide by 5. All right, so as long as x is less than 1/5 and bigger than 1, then this inequality will be satisfied. All right, you can see, going through the steps again, isolate. Let's actually write them down. Isolate. And again, remember, I'm not touching anything inside the absolute value when I'm isolating. The next step is rewriting it without the absolute values. And our last step is solving these new things. So those are our 3 steps kind of broken down in this example. All right, here's another example. Again, absolute value I'm kind of ignoring. I don't want to touch this. So I need to get rid of this 9 and this 3. All right, the 9 is by itself, so I can get rid of that first by subtracting 9 from both sides. And I divide both sides by -3 to get rid of that 3. All right, it's being multiplied. You don't want to add 3 because it's not -3 plus the absolute value. All right, it's being multiplied by the absolute value, so I divide by -3. So -9 divided by -3 is +3. And remember, with inequalities, you also remember this one extra thing that doesn't happen with equations. If you multiply or divide by a negative, you're just going to flip this the other direction. And now if I have a number, an absolute value less than a number, that means my distance wants to be closer to 0, so I want the kind of inside of the number line, which means I'm bounded on the left-hand side by this negative number, on the right-hand side by this positive number, and whatever's on the inside goes there. All right, so I think less than is actually a little bit simpler because it's just one kind of nice line rather than kind of 2 separate things. I still need to get this x by itself, so I need to add 4 to both sides. And I said both sides because we're so used to working with an equation, but here there's actually 3 separate pieces. I need to add 4 to all of the pieces. It's just going to be 1 is less than x is less than 7. This is a really interesting time. This is really the only time this happens when you have these inequalities like this. You actually have to add the number 3 separate times. Same process though. If we think about our previous example, isolate the absolute value, rewrite using your number line to help you, and then solving. Right, another example. Let's go through it kind of quickly. Subtract 12. I'm trying to get this absolute value by itself. Divide by 3. -4. And we saw when we were doing with absolute value equations, absolute values and negatives don't really get along. If this was an equation, this would have no solution because our absolute value can never be negative. But in this inequality, it's asking when is your absolute value bigger than a negative, well, my absolute value is always positive, and every positive number is bigger than -4. So my final answer for this one, don't have to do anything else, just all real numbers. So whenever you get a negative number, after you've isolated your absolute value, take an extra second and think about it. I could have this as a separate problem. Say I got a less than sign, this one would have no solution. Why does this one have no solution versus the other one, all real numbers? My absolute value is always bigger than a negative, but it's never less than a negative, right? So that's why those are slightly different. All right, so if you ever get an absolute value near a negative sign, I just think about the possibilities. Is it possible? It's either always going to be possible or never possible. I just think about those solutions and take your time with negatives. But here's one for you to try on your own. Not going to have a negative sign, so it's more straightforward. All right, go ahead and try this one on your own. I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. All right, and here's the final answer that you get. So the first part by now should be kind of straightforward. I'm trying to isolate the absolute value, so I add 10 to both sides and divide by 2. All right, so now I got the absolute value by itself. It's isolated. So I'm going to rewrite it without the absolute value. So if I'm less than a number, that gives me the kind of inside part of the number line. So that's why I have this compound inequality. I'm wedged between -5 and 5. And again, this doesn't happen very often when you have 3 things, but to get this x by itself, I add 5 to all 3 pieces, and then divide 4 to all 3 pieces. All right, and that gives me my final answer with the x by itself now. All right, so remember when you're working with these absolute value equations and inequalities, always isolate the absolute value first. Most common mistakes students make is trying to like add a number into the absolute value. You can't do that. So you just get the absolute value by itself and then rewrite it, making sure you're careful with your inequalities, less than or greater than. And if negatives ever come up, if you're always equal to, bigger than, less than, a negative with an absolute value, always take an extra second to think about, is it possible? Is it always possible? Those are the kind of outliers that are a little bit different than what we generally do for our steps.